Welcome to my channel, The Magic of Java. This is an extract from my first book, The Green Queen from Java. It's a novel, it's a tale, a yarn intended to entertain you. Yes, it does reflect my experience of falling in love with Indonesia, my experience of falling in love with an Indonesian lady, and my increasing awareness of the paranormal and black magic, or some might like to say my descent into madness. But it is just a novel. Any resemblance to real people is completely unintentional. Yes, it's based on my experience, so yes, it's based on people I've met and know, but amalgams or caricatures of them. I do mention real people and real-life celebrities and hope that they, along with anybody who believes they've identified themselves, will forgive me. Made was born over a dozen years before my first visit to Indonesia. This was just a stopover in Ubud, Bali, on return from Sydney. Even this is an exaggeration, as Dr. Ruth and I flew with the then cheap and notoriously unreliable national carrier, Garuda. It's still a drain on the public purse, but now much more reliable and, alas, no longer cheap. The plane had broken down in Bali en route to Sydney, necessitating an overnight stay. We missed the next flight, being already exhausted by the circuitous leg from Manchester. I think we were probably put up in a Grand Bali Beach Hotel by Garuda, but such was our tiredness and complete disorientation at not waking up in Sydney, I could never be sure. Many will tell you that Bali isn't Indonesia, which is an easy shorthand to explain how different it has become to the rest of the country. But I now know this to be untrue, an oversimplification, which allows Western tourists not to dwell on the strangeness and diversity of the Nusantara as a whole. Ubud was then largely devoid of middle-aged American and Australian men with ponytails and wearing sarongs. Or maybe they were there, but then they were youthful backpackers with an innocent appreciation of Ubud and all it had to offer. How times change. I can remember meeting up in the evenings with these eager backpackers and enjoying their company immensely, whilst now I spurn their bloated burlesques. I suspect this is not entirely illogical, for when a young person expresses a newfound interest in something like healing crystals, they're expressing a love for life and learning. But when older and they open a store in Ubud selling healing crystals, there is a smugness saying, "I know all about healing crystals," a closing off of learning and opportunities to truly engage. We stayed in a fabulous traditional hotel on Monkey Forest Road, one of the few then in Ubud. As the name implies, a monkey forest was at the bottom of the road, and I can recall beating its inquisitive inhabitants with bamboo sticks we had been armed with. Of course, when given the bamboo sticks, I had no intention of beating the monkeys, but they were so persistent, I was forced to relent. It probably would have been kinder to wave the sticks around in a menacing fashion from the start, but this wasn't within my collection of past experiences or misguided Western morality. As well as few hotels, there were also few restaurants then in Ubud, and we would find the same intrepid backpackers in each one we chose. I remember us all ordering Balinese-style duck one evening for the next, as 24 hours notice was required, and being a little bit disappointed by it, but in general I loved the food. I also remember the heat of each day being cooled at around 4 o'clock by a shower of rain, for things only to get hotter and humid in the evening, causing me to sweat during our meals, something I still occasionally do, despite now being acclimatised. I fell in love with Indonesia in Ubud. I remember sitting in a warung overlooking stepped rice paddies, maybe the most beautiful landscape I had ever seen, but on television seeing a modern and seemingly affluent society. I guess soap operas and advertising in most countries create an image of a middle-class nirvana, but in Indonesia you're left wondering, was it actually filmed in Indonesia, or in another country, such as Malaysia, as it looks unlike anywhere you've ever seen. I suspect they're now filmed in new developments in Tangerang, Banten, prior to them being tarnished by real people and the inevitable scruffiness that real people bring to artists' impressions. Unfortunately, on returning to Ubud, many years later, I was horrified to find the bohemian suburb of Perth that Ubud has become. A point not lost on Dame Edna Everage as she addressed a Perth audience for the final time. Although I am merely adding to the Western fallacy of the real Bali, a paradise lost. Of course, Ubud had always been somewhat bohemian, but on my first visit this reflected an indigenous artistic and spiritual community. Now the indigenous bohemianism has been supplanted by a global bohemianism, misappropriating from around the world with little recognition of their cultural significance. I remember visiting a very good restaurant with Maddie to see middle-class and middle-aged Australians, undoubtedly from Perth, being given salsa classes by youthful Indonesian instructors. Now, there well may be an interest in salsa in Indonesia that I'm unaware of, and I couldn't imagine middle-aged Australians dancing to indigenous dangdut music. That's not my point. My point is that Ubud has lost its authenticity and with it its integrity I falsely imagined it to have. I have now come to terms with the recent annexation of Bali, less so of Ubud and certainly not with Kuta, although rather enjoy a week in Sanur every so often. But culture is a living thing, adapting from global influences, and the image of Bali as a paradise lost was a Dutch creation. So I have no smug cultural high ground on which to look down upon Celeste Patterson. In any case, Celeste regularly visited Bali in an official capacity, although I believe this was largely restricted to Kuta. Maddie came from a small desa village halfway up the mountain in Gunung Kidul, a limestone karst to the southeast of Jogja. The karst landscape of Gunung Kidul making commercial agriculture impractical, rendering its inhabitants amongst the poorest in Indonesia, and a major exporter of labour to Jakarta and Surabaya. The inhabitants supplemented their subsistence agriculture by making musical instruments, wind chimes and ornaments from the bamboo, which seems to thrive in its arid soils. These are sold to middlemen before being retailed to visitors on Jalan Malibra in Jogja, while some are even exported to Australia and the US. Recently, the wife of Maddie's third brother has been taking the bamboo instruments to sell on Malibra itself. A kind-hearted woman with a broad smile, but only speaking Javanese and Bahasa, not so useful in selling her wares to tourists. Although a distant relative comes to Jakarta to sell them as the prices achieved are better still, despite it being largely devoid of tourists. Whilst being able to stay with us, or his sister Yani, he prefers to sleep on the street, maximising his potential selling time, as travelling anywhere in Jakarta takes so long. I suggested going to Bali, where I felt the market would be even better than Jakarta, but he'd already considered this impractical, as he would be arrested for sleeping rough. I'm not sure if it's actually illegal to sleep rough in Bali. Most probably it is everywhere in Indonesia, but only enforced in Bali. In Bali, each law, or more precisely, each visitor's desire, presents the local police with an opportunity to relieve the visitor of some of their foreign currency. Long after writing this, immigration officials in Bali began refusing exits to Australians whose passports had marks or smudges on them. Marks and smudges that were not so serious as to refuse them entry, losing their tourist spends. There is even a scurrilous rumour, which I am sure cannot be true, about the police's actions, and this is to repay the fee recruits have to pay to join the force on the island and gain access to foreign tourists. While small-scale incidents of such practices have been uncovered in Java, the police were found to be blameless, as civilians were behind this deceit. Although it is true that across Indonesia, would-be female recruits must subject themselves to a degrading and inaccurate virginity test performed by eager male officers. Jogja, or Kota Kebudayaan, City of Culture, with its kraton, or palace, the cultural heart of Java, even Indonesia, but this applies to the culture emanating from the kraton's mobility, priori. If Jogja is the noble heart of Indonesia, then Gunung Kidul is the heart of Indonesia's common people. Unkindly British people might say the arsehole of Indonesia, but that doesn't capture its natural beauty and cultural lore, not unlike Ubud when I first discovered it. Indonesia, and especially Java, still have the remnants of a partially applied Hindu caste system, and nowhere is this more apparent than in Gunung Kidul. Religious hermits used to live in Gunung Kidul's limestone caves, and probably still do. Traditions and beliefs still exist in Gunung Kidul that are mere memories and superstitions to many Indonesians. So whilst even fellow Javanese write off its inhabitants as superstitious peasants, they have a refinement about them which involves communal memories of a distant past. In Wonosari, the Regency's administrative centre, there is a temple with gaudy statues of Indian-inspired deities, something one would never find elsewhere in Indonesia, with the exception of Bali, and even then they would be more tasteful. However, I would not wish to mislead the reader. Statues and symbols of Hindu origin can be found in public places across most of Indonesia, reflecting the underlying Indian cultural heritage. At the time of Maddie's birth, it was still possible to find the Javanese rhinoceros wandering on the plains below, and the Javanese tiger in the karst caves. Locals claim you still can, but often blur the distinction between the ghosts of living creatures with the living themselves. It is still home to the Javanese leopard, an abundance of snakes, especially pythons, and insects only found in Gunung Kidul and the neighbouring regencies, provided an opportunity to claim that these strange insects to be sent as evidence as the work of one of Indonesia's Sunan saints. Typically, people from Gunung Kidul are short in stature and have dark skins, almost like those of people from central India, but distinguished by their flat noses and large eyes. However, Maddie was born with a light skin with a red hue, almond-shaped eyes and wavy red-brown hair, dark brown to a Westerner, but in Indonesia, where almost all hair is black, slight variations from this are immediately spotted and given vivid descriptions. In Jakarta, she is often called Chi, the name given to Chinese girls, although after visiting Gunung Kidul, her skin rapidly darkens, so this happens less. Once, when visiting relatives in Gunung Kidul, her mother introduced her as her daughter, and there was some nervous laughter that she had a daughter by a Chinese man, as none of Maddie's other relatives inherited any of her grandmother's looks. You see, although Maddie's paternal grandmother was Chinese, it was unrecognised, as Maddie's paternal grandfather was Balinese, with darker skin, neutralising his wife's light skin. Whilst Maddie's father claimed to be Muslim, I doubt if he was, having moved from Hindu Bali. Maddie's own mother was from further up the mountain, where people become much darker than those from the Desa. This is consistent with recent anthropological evidence, which suggests that Indonesia's original Melanesian, as in Papua, residents were concentrated in the less productive higher ground before breeding and integrating with the Austronesians, dramatically affecting their gene pool. Maddie was so small and weak as a child that her family did not believe she would live, so she slept in her mother's bed until she was 12. The poverty of Gurunkhidil was exacerbated by a father taking 2 wives. Unusual in Indonesia, but 4 are permitted under Islamic law, meaning that a father must have been, at least publicly, Muslim. Even today, the majority of the inhabitants of the small desa are related to Madi, although Indonesians, in common with most Asian people, apply the signifiers of family members to those without any blood relationship, a lack of precision which completely confounds this pedantic Brit. Tragedy struck when one of the few non-family members from the desa began killing its inhabitants, including Madi's father. He also enticed Madi's younger sister down a well, and experienced that has scarred her memory and leaves her unable to interact with unknown males, especially me with my ghost-like skin and complete lack of Javanese language. Probably simply a coincidence, but in 1968, 40 communists were reputedly thrown down a well in nearby Wonosari. The death of Madi's father left this already poor family in desperate circumstances. Madi attended the local school barefoot, with a plastic bag for her books, and having to sharpen other pupils' discarded pencils to write. Madi quite liked school, and particularly the attached Pramuka troop, the scout movement, which readers will be surprised to find is the largest in the world. But because she had no shoes, she could never take part in trips, such as to nearby Jogja and Surakarta or Solo. The school was, and still is, very basic, with few pupils likely to achieve academic greatness, nor indeed are they encouraged to do so, and despite being clever, Madi is no exception. I am not sure if it is in spite or because of its unambitious schools, but people from Gurunkhidil are noted for a thirst for education and self-improvement if they leave for more prosperous parts of Indonesia. There was never any money for meat save for the occasional meal of fried grasshopper, walang or belang, as it's known in Java, or children's sweets, and not even for rice, with the family surviving on singkong and its leaves. Some relatives came to Madi's family's rescue with gifts of rice and other arable products they had grown. Madi tells a story of stealing her mother's singkong supplies to swap for iced chendol, a sweet iced drink made from rice or sago flour, as she'd never experienced ice on her tongue. Of course, she got into trouble for depriving the family of their only food, but this is typical of Madi. She is one of the kindest, most thoughtful people you could ever meet, but has a streak of impulsive naughtiness, which just occasionally and often inexplicably comes to the surface. Maybe it was this impulsive streak that took Madi to visit an elderly lady in the mountains with a school friend. This nene was well versed in the Kejawan tradition, even though until I pointed it out to Madi, it was not a word she would ever use, and began teaching Madi how to pray via the Javanese Sunan. Although Madi never agrees that she is clever, she is, and picked up the prayers immediately, unlike the friend who quickly lost interest in her recently discovered diversion. This nene took Madi to her heart and began to teach her some of the most closely guarded inner liturgy of Kejawan and the various forms of fasting important to its adherents. I suspect this nene had reached the venerated stage of Alumo Bolosiwu. During one of Madi's fasts, which included days spent in a dark room, Madi was presented with a green blouse by a spirit. Then at the end of her training, the nene placed her hand on Madi's forehead, and Madi was entered by her protector. Certainly Madi's mother had a very good understanding of Kejawan, but limited of Islam, not knowing when and how to pray as a Muslim. One evening, a long way from home, Madi became frightened and remembered a prayer she had been taught. In an instant, Madi was transported Narogo Sukumo to the safety of her home. Madi's mother was also introduced into Kejawan, was annoyed when she found out, but insisted that it was dangerous for Madi to break off her training. Madi seemed to believe that her mother felt that such knowledge was better left to the males of the family, but it may have simply been a concern for a small and unassumed sickly daughter. In common with so many of Gunung Kidul's youth, at the age of 12, Maddie was sent to Jakarta to work as a maid for distant family members living in South Jakarta. It was intended that she would also find better education in Jakarta, but the family worked her hard, including in the warung attached to their house. She never experienced Jakarta's more ambitious schools, nor did she really want to, rejecting the trajectory determined for her of learning to operate sewing machines in a factory. A surprisingly large number of people in Maddie's Desa are illiterate, especially the men. In part this reflects the poor schooling, but also a high proportion of people who are not allowed to attend the school. Access to education is limited to those with birth certificates, which are only issued to people with a state-registered wedding. A good number of Gunung Kidul's poor could not afford to embark on the bureaucratic journey that registering their offspring would imply. Maddie would not have known where the airport was, and certainly would never have visited, but had she would have spotted this strange bule in a Manchester City top transiting to Sydney. People always assume that Maddie is from a wealthy background and that she has far more money than she actually does. When wearing costume jewellery, it is always assumed to be pure gold, and clothes bought from the Pasar market are assumed to be European designer labels. Of course, Maddie does now have some gold jewellery and a fair amount of clothing by Bebe and Guess, expensive in Indonesia, but hardly European designer labels. Just occasionally, when a naughty, impulsive streak comes to the fore, she will tell those she meets of arriving in Jakarta in a single dress, one pair of knickers and flip-flops on her feet, which the family must have saved up for to see her off from Gunung Kidul. She fails to mention the small rupiah note that her nenny had given her to ensure her safety, as she had long since spent it, preferring to put her trust in Allah. Although Maddie can still remember some of the prayers via the Sunan she was taught as a child. This cyclic child from Gunung Kidul developed into a beautiful woman with light skin and wavy red-brown hair. She developed a taste for dangdut music, and finding she had a voice, she was able to earn a little singing and dancing at weddings. At 16, and as soon as it was practical, she left the family. Work was plentiful in Jakarta, especially for an attractive young girl. Maddie moved from job to job in restaurants and shops, moving on when she got bored or the owners made advances to her. She even spent a short while at a store in Surabaya, where she picked up the coarse Javanese spoken in the city, despite Maddie speaking a more refined, quietly spoken Javanese from Jogja. Many people in Odessa speak it very loudly, necessitated by their animal husbandry, and having more similarity to the Javanese spoken in Solo than in Jogja. But Maddie returned to South Jakarta when the Surabaya shop owner's son became too amorous. Reliant on migrant labour, such jobs often offer basic accommodation, or Maddie would rent a kos, bedsit, on a monthly basis, as migrant workers still do. Maddie remembers this time with fondness, a carefree time, and the first she'd ever known. Money was tight, but more plentiful than she'd ever remembered. She even had enough money to experiment with makeup and fashion, something she must have spent hours on, as today she instinctively knows how to look good. She would sing along to dangdut in her room and was happy beyond belief. But Maddie was never really a teenager. She had never had a boyfriend, and in many respects she moved from Gunung Kidul a child and emerged from South Jakarta a woman. This time went on for nearly 2 years. Maddie was working in a restaurant below Golden Truly supermarket in Block M. She really didn't enjoy the work, but life was good. Golden Truly was cheap and popular amongst the masses, seen as part of the paternalistic culture which pervaded at the time. Even today, people in Indonesia will tell you that it was run by a charity by Ibu Tien, President Suharto's second wife. Golden Truly was actually founded by Bambang Sutrasino, a Chinese associate of Suwikatomo, the cousin of President Suharto. Bambang fled to Singapore on Suharto's deposal, later being convicted of embezzlement in absentia in 1999 and sentenced to life imprisonment. Golden Truly was used as a part of the insufficient collateral in the embezzlement. So far from being a charity, it was a part of the removal of Indonesia's wealth to Singapore banks. Maddie would always smile so sweetly at even the most awkward customers in the restaurant, as all Indonesians do. But to the Javanese, a smile is as likely to reflect embarrassment as it does happiness. But every so often she would seek revenge by spitting in their tea. Block M is the busiest bus terminal in Jakarta and one of the main shopping centres for South Jakarta. Block M Square most resembles a market in the UK and is linked to the terminal through a number of tunnels, also containing shops. It is known for its low prices, but products of sometimes dubious origin and quality. Almost a euphemism in Indonesia for anything Chinese. Nowadays, Chinese goods are described as imported, which has a distinct cachet over locally produced goods, with limited quality control. After all, turd gilding is one of Java's most ancient arts. Despite Block M's current image, it was originally conceived as an upmarket centre. Or is that true of all new developments? And recent developments do seek to gentrify the area. Certainly the residential areas around it are very upmarket and include the residences of many ambassadors. Around Block M Square are Little Tokyo and Little Korea, with Japanese and Korean restaurants and adult karaoke bars. Western readers may be bemused by the term adult karaoke, as in the West we are only familiar with family karaoke, but the names need no explanation. Western males, largely expats rather than tourists, can find similar entertainment on nearby Jalan Fatalayan, the nearest Jakarta gets to Thai-style girl bars, but with their fronts closed to the public eye. Indonesians who frequent bars are used to upmarket establishments and would never venture into these bars, but anyone used to clubs in the UK, they are quite acceptable. The loss of so many expats in Jakarta over recent years has caused Jalan Fatalayan to decline and feel a lot more menacing. Maybe the menace was always there, but less apparent, given the plentiful numbers of Western male targets in the area. This menace was recently reinforced by an ISIS group bombing the masjid on Fatalayan. The masjid is a mosque. The name mosque derived from the French misinterpretation of the Arabic masjid. Then one day an older male at the cafe asked her on a date. People told Maddie that he was from Korea, but Maddie remains unsure. Maddie had never had a boyfriend, never been on a date, and no idea what it entailed. Although her mother had once told her that it was dangerous to meet men at night, she had no idea why, and no family to explain. Whilst Indonesia was liberalising during this period, issues about relationships, especially before marriage, were never discussed, not even amongst friends, who were ephemeral anyway, given frequent job and lodging changes. Maddie wasn't really attracted to the Korean, but was excited by the prospect and accepted. After all, a date was far better than the attempted gropes and stolen kisses by store owners that she was used to fighting off. On that first date, in the Korean's car, Maddie lost her virginity. She didn't enjoy it nor want it to happen, but then again she had so little idea of what was happening she didn't fight it off. In any case, Maddie's impulsiveness meant that she often sought out new experiences, albeit that this was completely unwelcome. In the West today, we define it as rape, but Maddie simply sees herself as a stupid Gaddis Desa village girl who didn't know what she was doing. What ere is done she cannot know, and if you ask her, she'll swear it so. Whether 'tis good or evil, none's to blame. No one can take the pride, no one the shame. William Blake, from Poems from the Notebook. She met the Korean one more time in his apartment, and he repeated the act, asking Maddie to make a shape like a starfish. Again, Maddie didn't enjoy the experience, but she simply thought this was what young people did on a date. The Korean had asked Maddie to come to Korea with him, but not only did she not have a passport, she had no idea how to get one. He also asked her to come to Batam Island with him, a resort adjacent to Singapore and known for its girly bars and commercial bleep industry. But that was the last she saw of the Korean. Slowly, Maddie's stomach swelled. Then somebody pointed out to her that it wasn't from eating too much rice. Maddie realised that she was pregnant and what a mistake she had made. Even today in Indonesia, such things bring great shame to the family, but then it must have seemed like the end of her world. A world that had only just opened up for her and begun to enjoy, and she had already ruined it. All at once this world, something previously relished, was now an incredible burden. Maddie didn't even know how to get back to her family in Gunung Maddie drank bleach, hearing that it would kill her quickly and was readily available. It didn't, but she collapsed in the street in South Jakarta. A Javanese bajai, a motor rickshaw made in India by the Bajaj company, driver spotted Maddie falling and promised to help. A plan was hatched to claim that the child was the driver's, and he took Maddie back to the family, claiming her as his wife-to-be. The facade was broken when Maddie refused to take a shower with the driver, as her mother had suggested, and he was sent back to Jakarta. He did return, but now the die was cast, and he was... Of course, this was a difficult time for Maddie, leaving the Desa a child and returning with one in her belly. A neighbour suggested the baby would not be healthy unless she made love with him, although nothing could be further from her mind. Maddie tried to hang herself from a tree, but her brother cut her down. Not only had her mother not explained about making love to Maddie, she had led her to believe that she would give birth from her bottom. Nevertheless, thanks to Javanese herbs which dilate the cervix, the birth was painless. Her family became angry when she refused to cry along with them when she was giving birth, but Maddie saw no reason to. Maddie's birth, with her pale red skin, smaller eyes and red-brown hair, must have been a great shock to the family, but Widiati's must have been even more so. How could this very pale Chinese baby be the daughter of the dark-skinned Bajaj driver? No more was mentioned of it, not even to Widati, who is unaware of who her real father is. I remember visiting Seoul and seeing so many girls who looked just like Widati, but no one seemed to make the connection, and most assuming that her father must be Chinese Indonesian, even Maddie occasionally doubting it. Widati spent her early years in Gunung, a Chinese baby in a Javanese family, loved as much, maybe even more, as any child born into the family. On the few occasions Widati now visits Gunung, she is treated as something special, especially by Maddie's eldest brother. But Widati is now thoroughly a product of middle-class Jakarta, so much so she even refuses to speak Betawi, which is considered street slang, and dislikes the countryside without a trace of Gunung within her. Indeed, Indonesia has not experienced a romantic movement, and the countryside is seen as backward, even somewhat threatening. Maddie was sent back to South Jakarta to work, as her younger sister had some years earlier. Maddie settled back into short-term jobs and lodgings, but those carefree days had ended. Maddie's younger sister had met Prama, an elderly Javanese man from Purworejo, who had significant property assets. Prama had worked in local government and immediately bought some land when plans were released for an exclusive development. He'd built a large house and an adjacent smaller one in Pajaiten, now one of Jakarta's best areas, and kept some land to sell when prices rose even further. He already had 3 wives and was looking for a 4th. Maddie's sister was in the frame, but on meeting Maddie, she seemed much more suitable and desirable. Prama visited the family in Gurun and paid the eldest brother to give Maddie to him. Maddie really couldn't understand. Her mother was now single, and though younger, closer to Prama's age. Why did he want her and not her mother? Maddie had a number of other suitors across Java, none attractive or particularly desirable, but Prama was the first to pay off her family. Despite her impulsive streak, Maddie would not disobey her family and was married. Prama's other wives never really accepted this beautiful girl, and one threatened to kill Maddie. Maddie ran away, but was frightened of Jakarta and its police, and so returned after calling Prama. Maddie was horrified when the older man demanded his conjugal rights. She had not made love since the Korean left, and still really didn't understand why men wanted it, or that it was a part of marriage. She would lock her bedroom door as her elderly husband pounded on it, threatening to call the police. But eventually she gave in and found it even more unpleasant than with the Korean. More disturbingly was that Widati was never really accepted by this new family and would have starved had Maddie not been able to hide away food for her. Nevertheless, in marrying Prama, Maddie had secured Widati's future through being granted a birth certificate, Jakarta residence and therefore schooling. Maddie's sister Bude, simply meaning older sister, was also married, and her husband Mas Kunchara from Banyumas was working in a hospital in Jakarta. He managed to get Maddie some birth control pills, as neither he nor Maddie wanted her to have another child by this elderly tyrant. However, the pills ran out after 3 months, and predictably Maddie became pregnant once more. This sickly little girl was now all woman and extremely fertile. Titi's birth was nothing like that of her elder sisters and had to be facilitated by a caesarean section. Maddie suffered in pain in the public hospital all alone as Prama went shopping with one of his other wives. He did, however, visit after the birth and immediately picked Titi up, placing her big toe in his mouth. He got a good telling off by the sister, the name given to all nurses in Indonesia, but shrugged his shoulders in a Gallic manner which would be completely unknown to him. When Maddie was released from the public hospital, she was told by the doctor not to make love again for 20 days, although she had secretly resolved never to let her husband into her room again. But that night Parma pounded on the door, and what happened is much closer to many people's understanding of rape. Pinning this weakened woman to the bed with his arms, Maddie was in agony and felt worthless. Maddie's mind was made up. She did not want to bring any more children into the world, and certainly not by Prama. As Maddie recovered, she began to assert her independence and opened a warung in the house. Many people shopped at the warung of this beautiful young lady, especially Western males, who had no idea that this elderly man was a husband. One bully even asked Maddie to deliver his groceries and insisted on showing her his bedroom. Maddie may not have wanted her husband any longer, but she certainly had no intention of letting a white stranger hurt her. The warung did remarkably well. It provided food for Maddie and her 2 daughters, and frequently for the extended family living in the house, who would steal whatever they could from the warung. It even provided Maddie's niece from Gurun with employment. The niece was quickly propositioned by Prama and rejected, so he resorted to hiring massage girls to come to the house. Maddie and the niece would listen in silence as Prama had his way with his girls, embarrassed at every creak of the bed, too ashamed to ever discuss it. Life was, of course, not easy, and there were frequent fights with her now estranged husband. I call them fights, but Maddie is Javanese. She would never answer her husband back, no matter how she loathed him. Maddie wished Prama would have a stroke, and he obliged. Maddie was left running the warung and doing everything for her husband, including cleaning his bottom after he went to the toilet, the other wives having long since left him. But this was the beginning of a new relationship. He was still angry, a very un-Javanese emotion, and demanding, but no longer the tyrant, affectionately calling Maddie mother. To a certain degree, Maddie was regaining the independence she had enjoyed when she was 16. Despite being young and looking even younger, Maddie's daughters were growing up. She was and is a wonderful mother, and like most mothers from humble backgrounds, she wants the best for her daughters and that they should have the opportunities, more opportunities than she had done, and above all, not to make the mistakes she had made. I have seen Maddie speaking to her daughters when they are distressed, and she has the ability to combine passion with authority, completely calming the situation. She has a policy of never saying no to her daughters. Whatever they wanted, she bought, but only once, so they learned to appreciate it. The warung just about provided for this, but her husband's estranged family ensured that it provided little more. Maddie had taught herself to cook remarkably well and provided food for the entire family, but this didn't stop them from also taking what they could from the warung. Still young and never really a teenager, Maddie continued her love for dangdut and dancing. So when one night a neighbour asked her to come dancing, Maddie jumped at the opportunity. It was explained that she would go to the exclusive Hotel Nirvana and that Maddie should wear her best clothes. Although Maddie owned nothing really expensive, she had developed the knack of looking great in often inexpensive clothes during her time in the costs. So when the taxi arrived, Maddie looked completely stunning. Hotel Nirvana was another world. Yes, Maddie already lived in a very good area of Jakarta, where many expats also lived, but the opulence of the hotel was something she'd never seen before. The Paniki Club was full of handsome, well-dressed Western males, the sort of people she sometimes secretly dreamed of meeting and sweeping her away to a new life. All were older than Maddie, but few as old as Prama. All seemed to be like the men in her dreams. Like Westerners visiting Asia for the first time, the opposite sex look so beautiful. So too do white-skinned people to Indonesians unaccustomed to them. In fact, I was visiting Jakarta for my first time around then, but knew nothing about the Hotel Nirvana. I wonder if I had, we would have spotted each other. Maddie loves live music, and when the band started to play, she danced, as she had in her costs, completely loving it and losing herself. As she danced, she forgot about Prama and how miserable her life had been. It wasn't long before she started to attract the interest of these white-skinned men who offered her drinks, and she accepted a pineapple juice, slowly slipping it through a straw, as they spoke to her in a language she knew little of. Maddie smiled and was happy, even momentarily carefree again for the first time in many years. Later, it was explained that one of the Western men wanted to take Maddie to his room and pay her money. Maddie's mind raced. Why would he give her money? Like all Indonesians, she believed that all Westerners to be incredibly rich, so such acts of mindless generosity are not unheard of. However, she was completely horrified when it was explained that they wanted to make love with her. Maddie had only made love with 2 men, both a long time ago, both resulting in unwanted pregnancies, and neither was pleasurable. No, This new world, however exciting, was not for a good Muslim girl from Gurrenkiedel. She was a mother with responsibilities, maybe no longer a Gadis Desa, but little more. She was wrong to dream, and she just couldn't, however much money they would give her. That next day, Made developed a plan. The same plan so many pretty girls do in Jakarta when they are introduced to the nightclubs in the hotels frequented by foreigners. This is how she could find a Western husband, to create a new life for her daughters and herself. She would never ask for any money, but if given it, it would certainly help supplement the dwindling profits her husband's family were leaving her from the Warong. She could afford to send her girls to a better school, maybe even a university. Some may think this was Made's decision to enter the world of commercial, well, you know what it is. And that was certainly the doubt I had when I kissed her goodbye outside the Hotel Egret Slippy. But this was much too harsh. Perhaps Mistress best captures her situation, because she was aware that her boyfriends were already married, but unaware that they were unable to take another wife. After all, so many marriages being based on abuse of economic power, extramarital relationships are common in Indonesia, despite being haram. Made still has very little understanding of the world of commercial bleep workers, and somewhat naive when it comes to the more exotic bleep practices. Despite being friends of a number of gay men who for some reason, along with transvestites, are attracted to Made like a moth to a fly, she was horrified when I explained how men make love to each other. In Indonesia, once girls reach a certain age, which differs by location, but the upper limit would be around 28, they are shunned as spinsters, Perawan Jomblo. A good many in this older range will, like Made, have been married before, even though Perawan literally means virgin, often at a young age in their desas and subsequently deserted by their husbands. Finding suitable Western husbands was never a problem for such a beautiful young girl as Made. Convincing them that they should marry her and live in Jakarta was always much more challenging. That first night, after she had taken a decision, she met Alan in FT's nightclub at Hotel Emas, a younger crowd and even more upmarket than Paniki in the Nirvana. Alan was American and seemed caring. Actually making love was more problematic. Made had not made love in years, and only then with two smaller Asian men. Alan simply couldn't penetrate Made, but sent her away that morning with US dollars in a handbag and a promise to try again the next night, which they did with the aid of some oil Alan had brought and even more dollars stuffed in a handbag. Made didn't touch the dollars, but kept them in a large glass at home where they looked pretty. In any case, they had $100 written on them, and as 100 rupiah was worth so little the Bank of Indonesia didn't bother issuing notes for it, she assumed these also to be worthless. What mattered was she had found a new husband and a way out of the drudge her life had become. Later she tells of this same glass being stuffed with notes from many countries, all assumed to be worthless. Even Prama's light-fingered relatives believed the same, or the glass would have lost its colourful decoration. Made's joy didn't last long, as a friend who'd taken her to FT's told Alan that Made was a prostitute, despite the preposterous of a near-virgin prostitute, and took him from her. This same friend really did end up a prostitute, selling her rhea by fractions of the hour in Dubai and engaging in Ramadan bleep parties when Arab wives refused their husbands. Made was devastated. Alan was handsome, well-dressed, not young, but much younger than her husband. She wasn't really able to communicate with him, but she felt sure he had understood and was planning to marry her. How could this have happened? The only thing There was only one thing to do, and that was to try again, after she had recovered from the pain of losing her virginity for a second time. Of course, Alan eventually realised his mistake and contacted Maddie. But however perfect and naive, Maddie rarely makes the same mistake twice. Well, I hope you enjoyed this chapter. By all means, feel free to comment on it, including criticism, as that's the only way I can improve. Now, I really do hate it when channels keep badgering you to subscribe for them. But I suppose it does tell you when I'm going to post new chapters. I'm aiming to do this every week to 10 days, so it might be a good idea to subscribe if you want to. But thank you again for listening.